My name is Chandra De Silva, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of the Provost Conversations for this year. And this year, we are trying something new. Rather than have a faculty member come and talk about his or her teaching, we have a whole panel. And they're going to talk to you about what works and hopefully what doesn't work in psychology. And to introduce the panel, we have Jim Bliss. And so I will hand over the microphone to him. But before I do that, let me tell you that Jim is going to moderate the discussion. But be aware that he's a guy who researches on trust and mistrust. He also works on, is it human beings and robots? So he is probably the best person to introduce a panel in psychology because he goes beyond the discipline from psychology to robotics and all kinds of other areas, visualization and so on. Jim.
In the psychology department, we're very fortunate to have very talented instructors, and we've got 4 of them with you today to introduce themselves and talk about their teaching methods. I'd like to introduce them in order, starting with Dr. Michelle Kelly, sitting to my left. Dr. Kelly was a 2014 nominee for the Chev Outstanding Faculty Award and does NIH-funded research on the intersection of mental health, substance abuse, and partner violence. She teaches a large general education course that's required for several majors across campus. Next to her is Suzanne Morrow. She is a senior lecturer in psychology and one of our main advisors for the undergraduate major in our department. She too is an award winner. She won Instructor of the Year for the College of Sciences, and she primarily teaches online courses in developmental psychology. Dr. Richard Landers, sitting next to her, is an associate professor of psychology. He was a 2014 nominee for the Chev Rising Star Award and was a past winner of the ODU Teaching with Technology Award as well. He's an industrial organizational psychologist and an expert in assessment. Then last is Dr. Deborah Major, a professor and eminent scholar in our department. She's also an award-winning teacher. In addition, she is this year's Provost Fellow for Faculty and Staff Diversity. Her research focuses on career development barriers and how to overcome those. So today we're graced with these experts from the psychology department, and they're going to share their wisdom with us. So let's go ahead and begin at this point with Dr. Kelly.
First of all, thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see such a good turnout. So I've been told I have 5 minutes. So I'm like, what? Okay. So anyway, I'm going to very quickly talk a little bit about particularly techniques that I use, as Jim mentioned, in a large undergraduate course that I teach. It is a lifespan developmental course, which means it is womb to tomb. A lot of these students, actually, this is the first psychology and the last psychology course that they take because they have to take this course in order to apply for some of the professional programs, for example, nursing. So I have a lot of students that, again, have very little background in psychology. So I really want to do the very best I can to engage them in the material and for them to really learn how it applies to their kind of chosen or planned profession. So my goals are really pretty simple. One is really active learning. And I know for those of you who teach face-to-face courses with a lot of freshmen and sophomores who are non-majors, that's a kind of a challenging thing to do. I'm going to show you a lot of different things because I know you're in all kinds of disciplines. So hopefully there's something here that might be helpful. And really a deeper understanding of the material, which I think will come across. And also really developing critical thinking skills, evaluation, and writing. So I do a lot of writing, and I really stress that with my students. So active learning is really key to this course for me. From day one, they introduce themselves to peers, and I try to make it something that they tell us something about themselves that we'll all remember. So they do that with their peers to kind of start from day one getting involved and realizing that they're sort of responsible for kind of being involved in the course. I also do a lot of writing assignments, and the very first writing assignment I actually do, and my book also has an online component. So I have sort of, hard text or an electronic text that they purchase, and then they also purchase the online. So all the assignments are uploaded online, which is really great. But the very first assignment I have is tell me about yourself. And again, tell me something that will help me remember you. Tell me something that you want to get out of this course. And that kind of helps me kind of get them thinking a little bit about it. And then the very next thing I do, the first class, is I say, what do you want to get out of this course? So what's the plan? Specific plan for making that happen. And how are you going to hold yourself accountable? So throughout the course, I kind of check in with them, how are things going, and, do you need to revisit that plan, okay? Another thing that I do is I check in with people throughout the course a few times. And I will say, for example, I'll ask you guys, hey, what's one word that describes you today? So you think of your word, and I'm sure a few of you are thinking, oh man, it's the beginning of a semester, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. Well, I kind of strategically sometimes will check in so that then I can have them talk about how they're feeling, and then I'll relate that to a course topic. For example, feeling overwhelmed. Well, one of the things that helps protect people from feeling overwhelmed is social support, and we'll talk about how social support or things that you do can be positive and that you can benefit from those things and they can help reduce your anxiety, or they can be sort of, frankly, obligations. And I think we all know what we're talking about. And again, I relate that to sort of, hey, how are you feeling? And, how can you do things a little bit differently and kind of work it into the lecture, so to speak. So I'll do that periodically. Again, and just trying little icebreakers to get people involved throughout. Some of the specific kinds of techniques that I use, again, as I mentioned, my course from day one, assembly required. That's kind of a key to this course. And again, active learning, learning how the material applies to themselves, and learning how the material applies to their chosen profession, okay? Some of the things I do, I start with a quote to set the theme. Another thing that I do a lot of is I will use story time. So I'm a research junkie. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a research junkie, and I've done research in lots of different settings on lots of different things. And my grad students call it story time. And I will use story time to explain how my research really has been applied to solve real life kinds of problems. I think most of my students, my grad students and my undergrads that work in my lab really love story time. So, and I think the students do too, and they get it. They see how my work is applied. Other kinds of techniques that I do, believe it or not, I know people learn in different ways. I do a drawing test. I do a little drawing test. So I really shake things up a lot in my class. For example, when we're talking about psychoanalytic theory and the unconscious, I will have people draw a picture of their family. And then they'll share it with a peer, and they'll learn oh yeah, I never thought about that. I didn't realize, the dog was the center of the family. But there's the dog. And, they'll really, and then the brave students will share their photos or their pictures with everyone, and then we'll talk about them, okay? And again, relating it to class. Other kinds of things I do are, I have students enact skits. So I'll put them in little small groups of 2 or 3 or 4. And for example, defense mechanisms. I know a lot of you probably know what that is. So we talk about defense mechanisms. And they will really write a skit to enact defense mechanisms in class with their peers. Again, just little ways to make them kind of do stuff outside of class, come in, enact it, just kind of shake some stuff up, and the other students have to figure out what kind of defense mechanism they're talking about. Just little things I do. This is also great for anybody that happens to, or you're in a field where family systems, so you talk about boundaries. That might be for some of those, you guys who are teaching in business, for example. I mean, these same kinds of principles sometimes will apply. So they'll do skits where they kind of enact boundaries or enmeshment or triangulation or all of these kinds of things. So skits work really well. Music videos, students love music videos to illustrate concepts. Love them. I personally always have the lyrics because I do not know what those rappers are saying. I have no idea. So these are just, again, a few things I do. Surveys, I do a lot of surveys and exercises in class. I also do a little test which works well. I will have people tell me, and a lot of you probably, some of you anyway, maybe touch on the subject of adolescence at some time. I will have students anonymously, first thing in class, tell me the craziest, just write down anonymously the craziest, stupidest thing you ever did in adolescence. Okay? Then we show a video that talks about adolescent brain development, and I will talk about adolescent brain development. Then we'll come back to those anonymous things the students said. We'll vote on the absolute craziest, stupidest, and I'll try to explain that hopefully for most of them, the brain they have now is not the brain they had then. So again, I really try to interweave these kinds of activities. So I know we don't have time to go through all of these. One last thing I think students really like is I bring kids to class. A lot of times I will actually demonstrate the material I'm trying to use by surveying or interviewing a student in class to illustrate how it's done, or bringing kids into class and demonstrating tasks. Then I'll have the students explain how what they saw really relates to a theory that we're talking about, some of the things a child did. And finally, the last kind of thing that I wanted to mention is some of the writing kinds of assignments that I do. Again, I use this online component of the book, which is fabulous. And I'll have short, mini writing assignments where the students really have to think a little bit more deeply about the material and really kind of organize and do some critical thinking and some writing. So some of the kinds of exercises that I do, and I do a lot of different kinds of things. Sometimes I'll do these in class and outside of class, but just to give you an idea, like they do a career and personality inventory, and they find there, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Myers-Briggs, so they'll identify their personality, and then they'll write about how that relates to their chosen profession. Or maybe they'll think of somebody they know really well, and they'll do the Myers-Briggs for that person, they'll do it for themselves, and they'll talk about maybe problems that they've had, disagreements, and how their personality type might, why those kinds of things might occur. So again, it just kind of gets them active learning, relating to the material more carefully, digging in a little bit deeper, and again, I do quite a bit of the deeper writing assignments, the short writing assignments, to kind of make them reflect on the material. So those are just some of the kinds of things that I've done. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Suzanne Morrow.
Thank you, Michelle. So today, I'm going to talk to you about what works in terms of online education, particularly large sections of online courses. I regularly teach 2 online courses with 150 students each, so I've had a little bit of experience in terms of what works when you're managing large numbers in an online course. So first of all, organization is key. When you have a lot of students in one class, things can go awry pretty quickly. Students get lost, they don't know what to click on, they're posting things in wrong places, and then they're complaining that they're not getting grades for things because it didn't show up in the right place, or they didn't submit something in the right place or at the wrong time. So I really make a very concerted effort to organize every last thing that can possibly be organized. So first of all, I try to have a pretty easy to follow layout, and you'll see the screenshot there of the first screen that they see when they click on modules. And everything is dated, so they know what today's date is, they know where they're supposed to be in the course. And then once they click on that date, they'll get the module for that week, and I'll have a quick little introduction about what they're going to be doing. And then from there on out, it's step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, so that there's no, or hopefully there's no question about what it is that they need to be doing. I also provide students with a written course map with screenshots that shows them very, step by step, click this, and then click that. I also do a video, so I'll pull up a program that will allow me to narrate me walking through the different screens within Blackboard to show them exactly what their screen should look like and where they should be clicking. My modules run Tuesday through Monday, and so every Tuesday morning, students get an email from me that tells them exactly what they need to do and what clicks that they need to make so that there's, again, no confusion. Most assignments, I try to keep most assignments due on the same date to eliminate some of the confusion as well. So on Fridays, they receive an email from me to tell them what is due on the following Friday. So again, organization, organization, organization. Participation is just so important. When I first started doing online teaching, I heard a lot of students complain and say that, online class, you just read the book and take a test. And they were very disappointed in this. They didn't feel like they were learning. And I heard a lot of people say that they were teaching themselves the material. So I really try to get students involved. And because I have large sections, there's no shortage of people to be involved. So I do quite a few things. I have lots of wikis where the whole class is working on one particular document. They're creating the document together, and then we post the final thing at the end. Now, this is a good thing and a bad thing. When you have 150 people editing one document, it doesn't really work very well. So I have to come up with creative ways to sort of divide it up. We divide it up either by topic, and I let them pick themselves which topic they want to write on, or I'll just say last names. A through G, you're going to be doing this one, and H through M, you're going to be doing this wiki. That one was a lesson learned the hard way from lots of people trying to edit at the same time, which doesn't work. And wiki is getting deleted. Chandra, that's one of your don't works. Have many wikis. I do a lot of group projects. I let them self-select to do the group project and or not do the group project. And I can let them create their own groups, or I can assign them to groups. And I give them recommendations about how to participate. They can Skype, they can use a discussion board on Blackboard, they can cell phone one another, they can meet in the library. I give them lots of suggestions of how to get together and do their group project. I also do peer assessments. So I'll provide a set of questions, and the students will go in and answer those questions, and then other students will grade the questions that another student gave. And to piggyback on what Michelle was saying, I also use skits, but I do it a little bit differently. I have them create a skit and video it with their camera phones, and then post it to Blackboard. So many years ago, I went to a CLT event, and they challenged us. They said, anything that you do face-to-face, you can do online. And I really thought about that, and I essentially took exactly what I did in my face-to-face course and incorporated that into my online course. And it works. You have to be a little bit creative, but it will work. I also want to engage the students. If you've ever tried to read a PowerPoint presentation online, you see that it's just dry and flat and boring. And because it's usually just a bulleted list, you often read it and walk away from that going, huh? What did I just read there? So what I try to do is to video lecture all of the PowerPoint presentations. I haven't done it for all of my lectures just yet because it's a little bit time consuming and requires a little bit of technological savvy, but I'm in progress of getting all the way there. I've also incorporated quizzes in between sections of my PowerPoint presentations, because I've done a little bit of research and I found out that students are more likely to pay attention even to the video if there's some reason for them, some immediate reason for them to know that information. So I've just inserted little quizzes in between the sections in my PowerPoint presentations. Lastly, I want to talk about student-instructor interaction. When I first started teaching online, I really missed the face-to-face aspect of talking to students and getting to know them and talking about the field that I'm so excited about. Yeah, I videoed my lecture, but to have a dynamic conversation about the stuff that I love, I was missing. And so I tried to create a couple of opportunities for me to have that dynamic conversation and for the students to have that conversation as well. So one of the things that I do is an online review session for my exams. So I do it through Adobe Connect, and you'll see the screenshot up there. That's me in the corner and my messy background in my home. And below my picture is a chat window, so most of the students are chatting. I have a lot of students on the Adobe Connect session at one time, so they don't try to use their video. And then in the center of the screen there, you'll see the learning objectives that we're discussing for the exam. I have probably about 50 or 60 learning objectives. I don't have time to discuss all of them, but I discuss the objectives that I know are more difficult concepts. So I lecture, and I allow students to stop and ask questions. I talk about difficult concepts on the exam, and we get a dynamic interaction going on. And people can see my enthusiasm and see my passion for the course. And I really think it helps me connect with them and them to connect with me as well. One of the problems of doing a large lecture is that it's almost impossible to have 150 people on an Adobe Connect session. So to help with that, I do 2 sessions. I do an afternoon session, and then I do an evening session to accommodate students that work during the day. So that has cut the numbers down. I probably get, of course this is voluntary for them, but I get 30 to 40 students on each section, so it works. And people are very interested in doing this. I get lots of positive feedback that I have this online session. I also do online office hours. Quite frequently students will want to go over their exams, and so I just pull up Adobe Connect, I pull up their exam on the screen, and then we can talk through their questions. We can talk about new concepts that they're having difficulty with, or we can just have regular office hours like we would have face-to-face. And then obviously for my on-campus students, or the Norfolk students, I can offer in-person office hours. So those are just a few of the things that I do in my online courses, in my quest to make my face-to-face course look just like an online course. So I'll turn it over to Richard, who's going to talk about assessment.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how psychology has inspired me, and particularly my personal field of personnel psychology, which is psychology applied to hiring, personnel appraisal, kind of these human resources processes. The big overarching principle that guides a lot of my assessment decisions is something called Maslow's hammer. A very well-known psychologist, Abraham Maslow, stated, "It is tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail." And one of the big mistakes that we commonly make is we think we have a certain set of tools, a certain set of abilities, and we try to use those in contexts where they don't really, while they're functional, they don't necessarily get the most benefit. I see this a lot in my own research. In personnel psychology, a couple of examples that I have here. When designing a hiring system, it's really easy to just find a vendor, find somebody that's willing to say, "Oh, hey, give us some money and we'll get you the best people." Not the best approach. It's much more beneficial to start from the end rather than the beginning. Think, who do I want and what's the best way to get at them? A second example, performance appraisal. It's a lot easier to just go to people's supervisors and say, "Hey, just tell me how good your employees are doing." But we also know from scientific research, really bad approach. Supervisors are not by default very good at evaluating their employees. That requires training, it requires knowledge that they don't usually have. The third, most relevant to this context, when training employees, you need to figure out what you want them to know first, and then ensure that you know how to measure what they are going to learn. It's really easy, again, to go and say, "Oh, we're having a problem in our organization. I'm just going to go find somebody on the internet who's willing to sell me a training module that does that." But also not really a good approach. We know from IO psychology research, personnel psychology research, that you end up training things that are unnecessary. You waste time, you waste resources. So it's much better to start from the end. Start with what you, really carefully defining what you want to know, and then to move everything from there. Applied to the college classroom, that creates this 3-step process. Always first figure out what you want your students to learn. Then second, create the assessments to assess that thing, and only at that point create the instructional content based on those assessments. That's backwards from how we usually think of doing it. We usually think, I'm going to design this course, and then, oh, I got to design a test, or I got to make an exam, or I have to do something afterward. But the problem with that is it's really hard to create sort of synergies between those two pieces that you could create if you did in the opposite direction. That's kind of disparagingly in the elementary and high school kind of education crowd called teaching to the test. That's great if you wrote the test. You're the one that created the test, so that's not a bad thing for you. You should know what you're trying to learn, or what you want your students to learn. Importantly, if you can't figure out how to test something, your students aren't going to figure out how to demonstrate it. Something we think about, we don't usually think about when designing assessments, is that that assessment communicates to the student what you value. If all you put in are memorization questions in a multiple choice test, you have told your students all you need to do is memorize, and your professor, your instructor will be happy with that. So if you have higher goals than that, if you want them to apply things to their own lives, if you want them to learn how to process the material, then you have to assess it that way as well, or else they will never get that message. Now, that's not to say that multiple choice is inherently bad. It just means that it's difficult. If you ask multiple choice questions that they are just factual, and that's certainly the easiest kind of question to write, then that's all they're going to do. They're going to memorize to the extent they have to, and then they're going to forget it the week after the test. If you want it to be applied, then you have to write multiple choice questions that are applied and require the students to engage in that kind of higher level cognition. Written tests make that a little easier. Essay exams make that a little easier because you're asking them to produce information. You're asking them to parse through the material. Applied projects, I personally think, are the best option if you can do them. Presentations are also great too. Importantly, all of these can be done in person or online. I've done many applied projects in courses online, and I'll get to a little more about that in just a second. So some examples. When I teach research methods and statistics concepts in my courses, one of my primary goals is for students to actually apply those concepts to their everyday lives. So a few examples right here. A multiple choice question reads, a report on Huffington Post says research shows that women talk more than men in the average day. That actually was a research study that came out a couple years ago. Which of the following needs to be true for you to believe that claim? Now, I could have easily just said, in order to support causal claims, which of the following must be true? But then you lose that applied component. It's essentially the difference between a factual question and a word problem, if you think back to your elementary and high school math days. It just requires students to take that extra step to actually process, well, in the real world, how does this actually play out? For an applied project, reanalyze this data published on 538.com and see if you agree with their conclusions. 538 is, if you're not familiar with that, that's actually a blog run by Nate Silver. He predicted the last election, every state he got perfect predictions for. One of the great things about that blog, and a lot of places that you can get information from online, is that they just post full data sets. And so I can actually ask my students to go in and say, well, take a look at this data set and see if you agree. These people calling themselves experts, see if you can make yourself an expert and see if you get the conclusions you expect. For presentations, record a narrated PowerPoint demonstrating your analyses and explaining how to interpret the data set that you have collected. So when I have done statistical courses, I ask them to actually go collect data, actually analyze that data, and then explain what those data mean and how to reasonably interpret them. So very applied, and the entire course then is designed around giving them the skills to complete those projects. In a personnel psychology course, one of the things that I asked them to do is take a real data set that I collected in my past consulting work and analyze it for racial differences in hiring patterns. And I say, if you were running this company and you had this data set, would you need to worry? Is there litigation risk here? Is there unfairness going on? And tell me what you think. And that's a way to really directly apply the knowledge of statistics without just saying, here's a data set, calculate a correlation, and write it in this box. Much more applied and really reaches my teaching goals much better than those assignments alone. The last little bit that inspires me from personnel psychology, humans are really terrible at evaluating. We are not good at it. Even if you're an expert, and I'm sure that many people believe themselves to be experts in this room, as do I. Even if you're an expert, actually evaluating someone else's work and trying to figure out, do they have the right correct mind space, in a sense? Are they thinking about the concepts correctly? That's one of the hardest things that you can do, because it not only requires personal content expertise, it requires an incredible degree of empathizing to say, well, based on what they're saying, are they thinking the right way? So it's really hard. And even among experts, the agreement, if you have two experts evaluate the same topic, like say an essay exam, they will only agree something like 70 to 80% of the time. So that translates then into a couple of different principles here. All assignments should be revised regularly for consistency. you're not necessarily even very consistent with yourself from semester to semester. So it's important to consistently revisit the assignments and the projects, et cetera, that you've created to make sure they still match the way you're teaching the course. We actually shift a little bit, especially in in-person courses, not so much a problem online. We shift a little bit in what we emphasize and the specific examples we use and so on, and that can actually make specific parts of assessments more or less difficult from semester to semester. So it's important to keep going back and checking. 2, if possible, use multiple graders. Actually taking the average of 2 people evaluating something makes that number way more accurate than it would be from one person alone. That's not super helpful when you're the only person in the course, so this really applies more when you have teaching assistants. If you can have 2 teaching assistants grade at least a good portion of the assignment in order to look and see if they agree. If you can't do that, or that seems onerous, which it probably does, then the next better thing is to say, well, before you grade everybody, I want you 2 teaching assistants, for example, to grade the first 10. And then afterward, we're just going to talk about it. We're going to discuss why you might have disagreed so that we can have agreement moving later down the line. So that's a little easier to do. Third, this will seem strange to some of you, conduct focus groups on new assignments. Getting actual feedback about, do you really see this assignment as being relevant to the material we've covered, is incredibly useful feedback. If that seems like too much work, then the easier way to do that is to use a mid-semester evaluation and just ask on a question. Hey, we used this new project this semester. What did you think about it? Do you think you learned? Did you think you had an opportunity to shine, to perform, and just see what they think? And that's it for me. So I will hand it over now to Deborah Major.
Thank you. So Jim mentioned at the outset that I study career barriers and how to overcome them. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about teaching in the broader context of your career. And let me start with a barrier. How many of you does this apply to? I'd like to do these things. I'd like to do these things that Michelle or Suzanne or Richard just described, but I don't have the time. I have a lot of things going on, right? I have not just teaching, I have research and service responsibilities. How do we find the time? This is a valid barrier, right? And we all face it. So I want to talk about 3 strategies that research and career development supports as good strategies for overcoming this barrier, and that I've also had some success with. Let's talk about synergy, creating synergy between some of these what could be competing demands. If you look at responsibilities like teaching, research, and service, and you see them as separate things, as silos, that creates more possibility that they're going to conflict with one another and try to pull you in different directions in ways that compete for your time. But there's another way you can go about this. You can try to create synergy or make connections between your seemingly separate responsibilities in ways that really give you more time, right? They create less demand on you. So I want to give you an example from my own experience. In the psychology department, we noticed that our undergraduate students weren't being exposed to research early enough in their careers. They were waiting until their junior, most cases senior year, before they would take research methods and statistics. And this creates a lot of problems, especially for students who might like to go on to graduate school. We decided among the IO faculty that we would do a service project that would get students on board and exposed to research sooner. So we created what's called the Undergraduate Research Apprentice Program in IO Psychology. It takes freshmen, sophomore students very early in their careers. We get them in a cohort, we meet with them once a week, we talk about research, they get a faculty mentor, they get a doctoral student mentor. Sounds like a lot of work, right? Well, it is time consuming, but let me tell you about the synergy it creates. So we're in the business of training doctoral students in IO psychology in my department. They need to understand how to mentor and how to be mentored. They get that opportunity as part of this apprentice program. I have a research lab that's very active. It's NSF funded. I need help in my lab. I need effective research assistants. I can get those assistants more readily when they've had some early exposure to research. They come out of this apprentice program hungry for more research experiences. I can bring some of them into my lab and, oh, NSF has this extra funding that they will supply to you to support undergraduate research assistants. So now my department chair and dean are happy that I'm doing funded work, that I'm involving undergraduates, and we've got a synergy going. And then bringing it back to the classroom, when these students take my 300 level course, they are much more prepared and engaged and ready to learn. And not only that, they're little role models for the rest of the class, and they really help engage the rest of the students and motivate them. So that's just one example of how you might create synergies between demands that would otherwise be competing. What else can we do? Collaborate. I think it's a mistake to work in isolation, even on your teaching. It's interesting to me that as researchers, we're really encouraged to collaborate a lot. But then when it comes to teaching, we tend to take that on as our solo task. It doesn't have to be that way. There are lots of folks to collaborate with, including your colleagues here at ODU, in your own department. And I think it's especially rewarding to collaborate with teaching assistants. Back to that synergy idea, if you're in the business of training graduate students, talking with them about teaching and not just research is very important. Not only that, they're young, they're creative, they have fresh ideas. I learn a ton from my graduate students. So they're great collaborators. I also have collaborators on teaching at other institutions. Some of the doctoral seminars that I teach, there isn't anything like it on this campus, but in other doctoral programs of IO psychology, there might be a similar course, and we can collaborate and share ideas that way. And then professional associations too. In your discipline, you might find that your professional association has teaching resources. They give them away free to members. When you go to a conference, you might meet folks who teach the same thing that you do, and you can collaborate. And then I also have a list of what can you share? Lots of things, your syllabi, ideas, assignments. Making it collaborative, I think, is a win-win. Okay, and then the last strategy that I would share for overcoming the barrier of how do I implement some of the things I might like to is to capitalize on the resources that you have. And I'd like to congratulate you all because you're doing that right now. These Provost Conversation Hours are a resource that's available to you. And we have great resources available here on campus through the Center for Learning and Teaching, also through the Improving Disciplinary Writing Group. Many of us have gone through that workshop that helps you implement writing in a way that is not so time-consuming in your course. I know that's something that's really intimidating to think, oh, writing means assigning a 20-page paper and then I have to grade all those papers. There are many creative ways to introduce writing, and that workshop is wonderful for sharing that. I also want to share with you something that is new on campus. This comes a little bit from a reorganization. Lisa Mays is our executive director of the Center for High Impact Practices, and we're talking about teaching practices. So she works a lot with students, but her office is also going to work with faculty to be a resource to them. And she's getting her website up and running, but until she has it, she welcomes you to contact her. And some of the things that she'll focus on are e-portfolios, service learning opportunities, learning communities, and more. And then I would finally suggest that in terms of capitalizing on those available resources, don't be afraid to ask your department chair or your dean for resources. And one of the things that I've learned is that if you have been a good steward of resources in the past, people want to give you resources in the future. That applies to funding agencies like NSF, and that applies to department chairs too. So if you can show that, gee, you gave me this and I made something out of it, you're in a good position, I think, to get resources. So bringing this back around to your broader career, these strategies, I think, have more implications than just for your teaching, right? So engaging in synergistic roles, the research shows that we don't like to do just one thing. We don't like to have the same assignment over and over again. There's some psychological benefit to variety, especially when we can bring it together in a way that doesn't tax our time too much. Collaborating with others builds your professional network. Networking is a hugely important career skill, professionally and from a social support perspective as well. And then finally, capitalizing on those resources, I think, is a way to demonstrate your commitment to your own professional development and show initiative through the things that you find important.
I have a good question for you, Debbie. And it gets to kind of something that I was going to mention before if I had time, and that was, as a faculty member, teaching is important, we know that. But a lot of times the criteria that are used to judge our teaching success seem pretty artificial. So we have student instructor evaluations. How would you recommend best leveraging your teaching performance to look good for promotions, to look good for advancement, for tenure, those things? Are there strategies that you followed or could recommend?
Yes, and thank you for asking, because I think this also touches on questions that Jeremiah asked and that Chandra asked. I like to think about this in terms of student-centered products, right? When I think about how to invest my time in teaching and doing something that's new or time-consuming, I think about what's going to be of enduring value for this student. Sometimes I tell my students, if you write a paper for this class and that's all it is a paper for this class, you've wasted your time. It's got to be something that's going to get them somewhere, do something for them, be related to their broader goals. So we're moving toward e-portfolios, which I think will give us a way to show students' work. It will be certainly a way for them to collect their work. But as faculty members, we want to have our own portfolios, and it should be filled with not just what we do, but what have our students done as the result of interacting with us in the classroom or outside the classroom.
At this point, I want to thank the panel for their comments. Thank you very much.